Welcome back to our final lesson of character design for production. If you've made it this far, give yourself a little pat on the back. You've modeled a character, you've UV'd it, textured it, rigged it, given it a little animation. And if you've made it this far and you've got something to show, we may as well go to the effort of actually showing it off. So in this lesson, I'm just going to go over a very quick, simple 3-point lighting setup. And then we're just going to quickly go over some render settings so that you can output a final video and upload it to Facebook or YouTube or wherever you want. And in fact, if you've managed to get it this far, I would love to see whatever results you might have. So let's quickly dive in. We'll do some lighting and then I'll talk over some of the slightly more complicated things in terms of setting up an animation and what kind of file formats you should be using, etc., etc. First, let's do our lighting setup. I'm going to use Eevee for this just because it's unbelievably quick, and for this sort of cartoony style, Eevee is plenty for the sort of detail that we're going to need. And also, once you start diving into cycles, you get into a lot more complicated stuff, and we can do a nice, simple, easy setup with Eevee. So let's first of all jump over to rendered, and let's start looking at this under our final rendered view. Now you'll notice that as soon as I've gone over to rendered here, I've kind of already got a lighting setup. That's just because I've got an HDRI set up over here. I have just an HDRI always set up. I've saved that as part of my startup file. So I can just always jump into rendered mode and I can always just look at what I'm doing. Now in our case, we're not going to use this, partially because I don't actually have the rights to this HDRI and I can't share it with you, but I've also found that Eevee's not fantastic for using HDRIs. I mean, it does give you a kind of a something to look at, and if you just kind of want to preview a model, this is kind of cool. But you'll notice that it doesn't really matter what I do to the strength here. We don't get any real shadows. In fact, everything that we're getting down here can kind of be attributed to the ambient occlusion. Even though this can give you some nice, interesting results to start with, it doesn't produce real shadows in Eevee, whereas it does in Cycles. So we're going to get rid of this HDRI. I actually don't want to use it. And you can see that we're immediately plunged into darkness. This is where I want to start from. Let's go and let's start by creating a point light. And in fact, I'm going to split my view here so that one of these I can use as just my camera view. And I might go in and just sort of focus on the face to start with, and we'll make this just our viewport view. I'm also going to go to this little view objects type drop down here, and I'm going to hide our armature. We don't really need to see that anymore. As I said, I'm just going to set up a really simple 3-point lighting system here. You may have heard of them before. If you haven't, then don't worry. We're going to quickly go over a couple of basics. So to start with, we want one light, and we're going to use this to kind of light one side of Suzanne's face here. We'll put it slightly up so that it kind of simulates a sun. Oh, and just as a heads up, hang on, let me just delete this. You can go in and use a sunlight, and you could get, you know, some somewhat similar results just by, you know, kind of doing something like that. But I found that the shadows using the sun lamp can kind of do some weird things. It would probably be okay for a simple character like this, but I've started to not use the sun lamp just because I find it very difficult to control. So let's use a point light. We can go and stick that just off to the left of her face and just slightly up. And this can kind of be our starting point. Now, as with everything we've done before, let's make sure that we have a clean scene. So let's go and create a new collection here. We'll call this lights and drop that point light into here. And this is going to be our key light. So this is going to be our main source of light in the scene. And we're going to kind of simulate a sun here. Immediately go and turn on contact shadows. You pretty much always want to be using contact shadows. There might be a couple of rare exceptions where you just kind of want a bit of a fill light, but if you want to go for more realistic lighting, use contact shadows. We're just going to go in and tweak a couple of these settings a little bit. Actually, I'm just going to go and disable these for a moment, just so I can kind of tell which are my shadows and which are my faked contact shadows. So let's go and look at her face here. And we can sort of play with the radius of our light here, making it bigger. Kind of softens those dark shadows a little bit. So we want to go for something that's reasonably large on the radius. Just because we are trying to make her look nice, and softer shadows give for a nicer look. I'm also just going to go and move this out and down a little bit so we can get this highlight in her eye. Having highlights in your eyes gives them just a little bit more life. It's a little bit morbid, but you can tell if somebody is dead because all the moisture goes out of their eyes and you lose these highlights. So you want to have these highlights in here, otherwise your character will look dead. So I've just moved that a little bit further away. We will crank up the power to compensate. And we don't want to go too high, or we're going to start to blow out some of our details there. I'm going to keep this around about 40, I think. And you can also play with the softness a little bit. You can see that it's not doing a great deal. It's more on the arms and the ears. You do want a little bit of softness though, so I might go with 2, just a little bit more harsh than the default. So now we'll go and turn on our contact shadows, and that's these shadows down here that are contacting the floor. We definitely want these to be a lot softer. So I'm going to go with something about 1.5, just to soften that up a little bit. Now, if this was a real sun, you'd probably be going for something fairly harsh. But this is kind of going to be a bit more of a studio lighting setup. And as we've done with the face and softened everything, we also need to do the same. Oops, that's the distance. We also need to do the same with our contact shadows, otherwise they're going to start to look a little bit weird. So what did we have here before? 1.5. Let's leave it at that for now. That's probably enough for our key light. I'm just going to go over to the top view here, grab our key light and duplicate it, and move it over to this side of the face. Now I like to work on one light at a time and then kind of turn them all on at the end and blend them in together. I just find that this makes it easier to control. So we're going to start over here. Now this is going to be our fill light, and basically the purpose of this light is we've got all these dark shadows that are kind of forming on this side of her face. The point of this is going to be to fill all of this in. So I'm just going to pull this back a little bit. We don't want it to be casting too much on the front because we've got our key light for that. This is going to be probably somewhere about here, just so we can pick up the side of that face. And I'm also going to lower it a little bit. We don't want to go too far or we start to get into this creepy territory. So we'll go with somewhere about there, and I might still just bring it forward a little bit. I want to try to take this shadow off the cheek. Not completely. We still want shadows because that helps define the shape of everything, but not too much. So I'm going to leave that about there. Now this being a fill light, I want this light to be quite soft. So even though we softened our key light, I'm going to soften this one even more. So let's drag this one up, and I think about 0.5. You can see, particularly around that cheek area, that blends in a little bit nicer. And I think 0.5 is going to be good for us. Where are the contact shadows hitting here? You can see the contact shadows down here on the foot. I'm just going to go and soften those as well. I think about 3 will work nicely in this case. I'm just going to go and let's name this key light. We'll call it Fill. Just going to turn on our key light for a moment. And you can see that we've got very similar values for our power here. In fact, exactly the same. And the distances between them must be fairly similar because we're starting to get kind of a little bit of a washed out look here. We can't tell where one light starts and one ends. So I'm going to grab the fill light here and just dial that down. In fact, I like to just bring it down to basically 0 and then slowly dial it back up until we start to see that filling in. And I think probably about 6 or 7 will work okay for this. I'm going to go back to our key light just because it's got the higher power level here. Go back to our top view and duplicate that, and I'm going to go and make our rim light. Hide these other two. So the purpose of the rim light will be, well, it's already starting to do it. You can see we're getting these kind of light highlights around the side of the face, a little bit on the ear here. It's actually working quite nicely down the side of the body, and the whole point of this will be to pull her out from the background, just to add a little bit of contrast. Let's move this a little bit closer, make that a little bit brighter. Kind of just shift this around a little bit more, just so I can get a little bit more on the ear. Something like about that. That's not too bad. You can use the radius here quite nicely, and you can see the smaller I make it, the harsher those lights get. The bigger I make it, the more that light starts to wrap around the side of her face. And you can take it to some quite extreme levels. I'm just going to keep mine at around about 1 meter. Actually, that might be a little too much. Yeah, let's go with about 0.5. I think that should be okay. Personally, I like to have quite a strong rim light. I think that might be pushing it a little bit too far. I might go with about 50 here. I think our shadows are probably going to be about right for what we're using here. Let's go in and name this as our rim light. Let's turn our other two lights back on and just have a look at this. I'm reasonably happy with how that's starting to look. One little tip that you can do to sort of gauge how your lighting is in terms of brightness, whether you're getting nice readability on your forms. If you go down to color management, under the view transform, you've got it set to filmic. That's what it is by default. That's what we'll do our final render in. That's quite correct. But if you just go to false color here, you can see that you end up with this rather bizarre neon kind of thing. We can use this to gauge how our lighting is going. So if I just grab, let's go with our key light here, and I just sort of play with our power, you can see that the more I brighten that up, the hotter that gets. And then as I start to bring it down, as we get into our blues, we start to get colder until we hit black and things start to disappear. So the ideal that we want is kind of this midpoint around here, where it sort of goes into this sort of grey sort of territory. And maybe just a little bit brighter than that. So, well, we had this at 40 before. I think that's about what we want. But what you can see is that I'm losing a lot of detail in her legs, which I'm not liking. So although this is technically a 3-point lighting setup, I might just do a little bit of tweaking just to try and fill in these legs. So to do that, whoops, I'll just grab our fill light and duplicate that again. And just kind of bring that down in front of her feet, somewhere about here, and you can see that starts to fill it in. I mean, this is her legs. We're not going to be ridiculously focused on them, so they can kind of fade into darkness a little bit, but I just want a little bit more light down there. I'll go and reduce this thing's radius, and we can sort of play with the power there. I'll allow it to drop into shadow, so I might go with about 5 here, just to sort of step it away from that black that's starting to come in. So I think 5 will work okay. And that seems to have given us fairly good coverage on our lighting. So let's go back and set this back to Filmic, which is what we're ultimately going to be rendering in. I think that's starting to look fairly close. What I am noticing is that we're getting a lot of darkness in certain areas, particularly around the feet. Now that's not actually our lighting in this case, that's our ambient occlusion that I think is just turned up a little bit too high. You can see that with it off we kind of get these grey values, which is sort of more what you would expect in this sort of environment, and with it on we get these really dark black values. So I'm just going to go in and sort of reduce my factor a little bit and just sort of take a guess here. I think about 0.25 is going to work in my case. Yours may vary a little bit, but that should be fairly close. So that's given us something to start with. Now, one problem that we're going to face is that because this isn't just a still frame, she's actually animated, we may run into some additional problems. So as we scroll through here, actually that hasn't turned out too bad. Just be careful with your key light here. If you put it up a little bit too high, as she ducks down you'll get these dark shadows forming under her eyes. In my case, I think I've actually done an okay job there. So I'm happy with that. And then as she jumps, she's going to jump up quite a long way. And you can see that now we're starting to get this really kind of weird, creepy lighting where all of our major lights are now underneath her face. So we're getting this underlit appearance, which is kind of making her look a little bit demonic, I suppose. So I really don't like that. We're going to have to fix that. I think the rest of the animation is okay. It's really just this little bit that we're going to have to fix. So there's a couple of things that we could do. We could actually animate our lights and have them move with her. Although that may do some slightly strange things to the shadows. I think in our case, I'm just going to take our key light here and duplicate it and put one up just a little bit higher. Maybe move this back and stick this somewhere about over here. You can see that still kind of looks like a sunlight. That's not too bad. And then if we go back to our initial pose and just kind of zoom in on her face, if I hide this, you can see that it's not making too much difference to our result here. If anything, it might even be giving us a slight rim light, which I'm not opposed to. So I think that's set up our lighting okay. A couple of other little things that I want to do just to sort of tie all of this together. Just noticing that her eyes look a little bit dark. So I'm going to... Now, this is one of the slightly annoying things with using linked characters. I can't actually access her eyes from here. So we're just going to have to go and save this scene. Now, you'll notice that I've still got this saved as jumping test animation. We're going to rename this file and save it as something different because we're now moving on to the next stage of lighting and rendering. So let's start by going save as. And in my case, I always like just add a little render into the name of my scene. Now you can kind of add that just about anywhere in your file name. I personally like to go and put it in around about here, because once you end up with 20 or 30 different shots, having render written here rather than say written back here, it reorders, it changes the order that things appear in your list here. So by putting render in there and going save, let me just save this and I'll show you what I mean. So if I now just go back and go open, you can see that by putting render in before shot 1, it's put the render at the top. And I just find that really useful when I'm going through and having to open up a whole bunch of files. If all of my rendered shots go up here, so it's rendered shot 1, rendered shot 2, rendered shot 3, all the way down to shot 30 or something, and then it will start listing just shot 1, shot 2, shot 3. It just helps separate them in your file browser here. Okay, so we've got that saved. Let's now go back and open our master rig. So over here in the master rig, I'm just going to go to Suzanne's eyes over here. Let's just toss this into rendered mode so we can see it a bit better and turn off the wireframe. And I want to select her eye and just make sure that you've got the cornea selected. If you remember rightly, that's the shiny bit on the outside of the eye, kind of the eye glass. Let's just go into here. There's a few different things that you can tweak. You could potentially tweak the index of refraction, but you can see that you can get some strange results if you do that incorrectly. But you can use that to kind of brighten the eyes. But I liked the setting that we had before, so we're going to leave that alone. You can also try playing with the alpha, but well, actually, let's just I can give you an example here. So if you start playing with the alpha, you can see that initially it does nothing. That's because by default, Blender doesn't do alpha, but you can tell it to. So if you go to the Material tab, scroll all the way down to your settings, and go to the blend mode and swap it to either alpha hashed or alpha blend. I personally prefer hashed. There's a couple of little advantages that it gives, but you can kind of choose either. If we change it to hashed, and now you start dialing that back, you can see that it will get a little bit brighter just because a little bit more light's getting in there. But if I go and set this to about 50%, you can see that the refraction starts to act a little bit strangely, and we get, you know, the actual eye shape, and then the refraction kind of on top of it, and I just find that really undesirable. So let's go and set that back to opaque, and make sure our alpha is set back to 1. The one other little thing that we can do is go to the base color here, and you can see that this is not set all the way to white. So if I just go and push that up, you can see we get a little bit more brightness in the eyes. So you can use that to kind of brighten or dim your eyes. You could also go to the eye color itself, potentially brighten your eyes that way. Remembering that we have multiple materials set up here, so we should probably set that to pure white as well. And obviously the pupil needs to stay black. Oops, I've accidentally unconnected that. In fact, while we're here, the pupil itself shouldn't have specularity. So let's just go and get rid of that. Okay, I think that's kind of fixed our eyes. Let's go and save this file again. In fact, I'm just going to go and close that. And save it like that. And go back to our render shot this time. And if we go and set this to rendered, you can see we're now getting some slightly brighter eyes. So I think I'm happy with how this is looking. We've now fixed that jumping lighting, and that looks quite nice. One last thing that I'm going to go and tweak is going to be this background here. So you've got the option of either having transparency on and off. In our case, it's actually not going to matter because we're going to use this ground plane here. In fact, I've got it unselectable. Let's just make it selectable. I'm going to use this ground plane, and I'm going to give her a kind of backdrop here. So let's just go into edit mode and extrude this up and just kind of create a wall behind her. And I might also just scale this out to the sides a little bit. Now, one thing you'll probably notice is we're getting this really rigid line going down the bottom here. If this is just in a house or a room, that's fairly acceptable. But it looks a little bit weird in this kind of studio environment. So let's just go and hit Control B to add a bevel and just scroll that up, and then if we go and scroll the mouse wheel and add a few extra segments, you can see we get rid of that line. Now we're still getting a little bit of jaggedy line weirdness there. That's just because we need to go into smooth mode. And you can see that that's working a little bit better now. One final little thing that we can do, we're still getting a little bit of darkness in some certain places. So I'm just going to go back to our world node here and just click use nodes. And this is what we had before if you use it completely in black, or you can just sort of add a little bit of extra fill light. That's obviously way too much. We just want a tiny little bit somewhere about there. And that can kind of be used to simulate bounced lighting, which you would have to go in and bake your indirect lighting to be able to get in Eevee. Using this bounced lighting can kind of fake that. So I think that's all looking pretty good. So let's just have a quick look at this. Now, one other thing I'm noticing is that we're getting this fairly large shadow appearing on that backdrop. And I wouldn't mind just getting rid of that. Let's just go back here. Select our back there, and I'm just going to go and shift everything back quite a bit and then scale it out in the X again. And that's kind of shooting it into darkness, which is a little bit less desirable. So I might just light the background a little bit here. I'm just going to go and grab, I think I might actually use an area light this time, just because using a point light is kind of going to create a hot spot in the middle, which will then sort of fade off into the darkness. I don't want that. So let's use an area light. Let's just kind of center that a little bit. We'll go and put this about here. Just move it back. You can see we're getting this line if we go too close. So let's just do that a little bit. Crank up the power somewhat and make that size a little bit bigger. We don't really need shadows at all for this one, so we can kind of turn all of those off without it having any detrimental effect. And you can kind of control now just how bright you want that background to be, relatively independent of anything else. Okay, so this has got a little bit more advanced than a 3-point lighting setup, but I'm fairly happy with this. Let's just go and make sure that that is under our lights. And let's call this, let's go with stage light, because that's a stage light. Okay, we can kind of close all of these now, make the background unselectable. We don't need to be able to select the lights. Oh, hang on. I'm just noticing that our plane here, since we moved it backwards, is not stretching as high as it was before. Let's just make sure that that's fixed. And there we go. We have a nice little animation that is ready to render. When we were looking at our reference, we kind of reframed this shot. I might just go and change our dimensions slightly. So we've currently got this as 1920 by 1080 or HD, just inverted. I think in our case, you can see that our hands are actually getting clipped there. We definitely don't want that. So we want to make it a little bit wider. The height of her jump is about here somewhere, so it also doesn't need to be quite so tall. So I'm going to try 1000 by 1500. And that gives her enough room on either side that she's not clipping. and there's a little bit of room in the front and the top for her to jump into. In fact, I still feel like that's... I might try 1400. Let's just go and make our camera movable again. And I might just zoom in ever so slightly. Yeah. Okay, I think that's good. Let's lock our camera down again. Save the scene. And let's go have a look at some of our render settings. Oh, actually, one last little thing that I wanted to do. I'm just going to bring up our original Suzanne image here. Where's it gone? It's disappeared at some point. Hold on a second. Let me bring that back. Under reference, I believe. Here we go. Our colors between these they're just a little bit different. And I think we can kind of fix that if we go back under color management. You can change the look of your final render, so you can go with something like a very low contrast, which makes it look really washed out, or you can do things like going with a very high contrast, and you can see this is probably a little bit overdone, but this is getting us a little bit closer to our original look. So in our case, I think I might go with high contrast, which will also make her pop just a little bit more, and bring those colors a little bit more in line. Okay, so with that, let's jump into quick explanation of file output. So first thing you're going to want to look at is your frame rate, because we are doing an animation here. This suddenly becomes important. Now, there's a whole heap of different things that you can use in here. This has the potential to be very, very confusing. Generally speaking, anything above 30 is kind of in that experimental realm. Like some of your big budget Hollywood films are now being made at 60. I think even recently they've been upping it to 120. For the sort of work that we're doing here, it's unlikely we're going to need anything quite that high. What you're going to be looking for is somewhere between 24 and 30. 24, I think, is starting to become a little bit defunct. Generally speaking, at least in Australia, which is where I'm from, you're looking at 25 frames per second. If you're working in the US or distributing anywhere in the US, you're going to be looking at 29.97. Generally, all of these formats, 24, 25, 29.97 or 30, will also work for uploading to YouTube or something, some sort of online format. So you've probably got these four to pick from. Generally speaking, I work in either 25 if I'm working for Australian clients, or 29.97 if I'm working for US. Those are basically the two formats that I use. I'm in Australia at the moment. I realise that Blender community is all over the world. I'm going to use 25. Depending on what region you're in, you may need to use something slightly different. But if we're just going to upload to YouTube, then 25 will work just fine. Now, the next thing that we need to remember, the next thing you want to think about as we're getting ready to render is what file format do we want to finally show this in? Now, again, let's just assume that you're going to put this up on YouTube. This is just a test animation after all. Maybe you want to show off all the work that you've done here. Ultimately, you're going to be putting it into some sort of movie format. So you could be using AVI RAW. This is just going to be a massive file because it's literally raw. There's no compression happening to your video whatsoever. Unless you are delivering something and a client has specifically asked, we need it in a raw format because we wanted to do stuff, some additional compositing work to it afterwards, generally avoid RAW. AVI JPEG is somewhat similar. I think this is kind of becoming a little bit of a redundant format. When I'm making a video, I will pretty much always use this FFmpeg video, which, if you go under encoding here, has a whole heap of additional options. When you're going to do a final render, like we're about to do here, you generally do not want to be putting it straight into a video format. The reason for that being, if you were to, this is going to be a fairly quick render. In our case, we're using Eevee. It's a very simple scene. But if this was much more complex and there was environments and displacement maps all over the place, each one of these frames could take a couple of minutes to an hour. So if you got halfway through your animation and something went wrong, which regularly happens, I mean, it might just be a simple power out, or it might just be something goes wrong in Blender and even just one of your frames messes up, and you've put it into a video format, you have to start from scratch. There's basically no way to fix that one frame, even if all 99 of your other frames are perfectly fine. There are some ways, but they get a little bit hacky. So what we want to do is actually export it as some sort of image format. And once we've rendered out an image format, we'll then bring that image format back into Blender or your compositing program of choice, and then render that into a video. There's just less things that can go wrong that way. So you've got a number of different options here. If you're working at a fairly high end, I'd recommend either using the one of the OpenEXR formats or a TIFF, or maybe even a Targa, but one of those three. Those give you very, very high quality images, minimal compression. Only problem with those is they do take up a fair bit of size. They take up a fair bit of space. They're fairly large file sizes. You can definitely work with those, and if you're maybe going for a final product for a client, you might want to use one of those. In our case, and again, this just being a test animation, I'm going to use a PNG. I find that gives very good quality whilst maintaining some very small file sizes. So I'm going to go and render this. So let's just go back to our projects over here. I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call this images, and this is where all of our rendered images will go. Now, as we know, we may end up with multiple shots here. So let's create another folder and let's call it this jumping test animation. _ shot 01, because we may have multiple shots. Let's go and save this in here. Let's just go and copy that. Shot 1, I'm going to put an underscore here and go accept. And this little extra underscore will now just give us a little bit of a gap, because Blender will automatically go and add our frame number after that underscore. Okay, so let's just go and give this a quick save, and let's go up to render and go and render the animation. And if your scene file is still set up from your animation where we had this reference, you're going to get this, which is clearly not what we want. To get rid of this, we need to go down to post-processing, and if I just swap this back to the video sequencer, you can see that this is what's causing us issues. This is called the sequencer, and we've still got the sequencer selected down here. So we can either go and remove this from here, or we can just disable the sequencer down there. And now, hopefully, if we go render animation, we'll get our actual viewport. And you can see that that's chugging through things quite quickly. This is the joys of using Eevee. I'm just going to let this render, and I'll be back in a moment. Okay, so we're back and our render has finished. So let's jump over to the compositing workflow here, and let's now get this made into a final video. So I'm going to jump over to Compositor here, and we're going to go and check Use Nodes. I'm honestly not sure why we have this Use Nodes checkbox here. I'm not sure what you do if you're not using nodes. I've literally never not used it. What we have here is our render layers. This is actually not what I want to be using. What I want is an image. So this is what you use if you're trying to composite your actual render layers, which we're not using in this case. We've now rendered our frames out, and we want to go and get those frames. So let's go and open, and let's just go to tutorials and images, and in here I'm just going to go and tap A to select everything. And you can see why it was important that we added that little underscore there. We can now see what frames we're up to much more easily. You can imagine if we didn't have that, it would be shot 010001, and that would just be confusing to look at. So if we now go and open that, we can disconnect this, and we can go and reconnect this to our final compositor. Now you can see in this scenario that we can't actually see our final image here, even though we've got this backdrop checked up the top here. So what we want is the viewer node, and you can see now we've got this little crosshatch sitting at the back there. If I now go and attach that to the final image there, you can see that we're now getting, our final image. And we can use the V and the Alt V keys to zoom in and out. Now you can see looking at this that this kind of looks a little bit more saturated than it should. That's because we've already baked our color management in with high contrast. So we can actually now go and set that to none, and that'll give us the look that we want. Final little thing I'm going to do before I put this into a movie, I just want this to be just a little bit lighter, and we can do that in two ways. We can either tweak our exposure here or our gamma. And that would be one way of doing it, or we can do it here in the compositor. If we go and grab some RGB curves and stick that in between both of those, and then we can kind of just brighten that a little bit. Don't want to overdo it. Probably the shadows that I wanted to brighten a bit more, so I'm going to go and grab those and kind of leave the highlights roughly where they already were. You see that's just, if I swap back and forth between those two, that's just a little bit darker, that's just a little bit brighter. I don't want to do too much here. I might also just go and grab a brightness and contrast. I think this is just looking a little bit too contrasted. So just go and reduce that contrast. Oops, that's way too much. Just want this to be a little bit. So maybe -1. Just kind of tweak these back in a little bit. There's our original image, and here's where we've ended up. It's very, very subtle, but I'm preferring that just a little bit. Okay, so we've now got this set up. Now remember, we are currently in the compositor. So post-processing, we need compositing checked here, which it is by default. Leave the sequencer turned off. And what we can now do is go over here and we can talk about our video formats. So as we discussed in the previous video, I like to use this FFmpeg option because that just gives us lots more options down here under encoding. There's obviously a lot of different formats that you can use here. So I'm just going to share with you the one that I use most frequently. It gives very good quality with minimal file sizes, and it's also a format that your online platforms like YouTube or Vimeo will accept. There's a whole heap to learn in here, and I've spent years trying to figure out what is kind of the best encoding formats to use. And this is one that I've been using literally for years and has continued to serve me very, very well. So I'm going to go and change this to MPEG-4, and then make sure that you've got H.264 selected down here. Of all the different options that you have sitting under there, this is the one that I have found works extremely well and gives me fantastic results. You can then choose to kind of tweak your quality a little bit. I don't see any reason why I wouldn't want high quality. And encoding speed, I'm not too concerned about. And the rest of it we can basically leave blank. We currently have no audio, so that is fine. That is the format that I like to use. If you wish to use something else, please go forth, but just remember that changing these settings can give you drastically different results. Massive file sizes for very minimal increases in quality. So I'm once again going to go and save this. This time we're going to go and hit render animation, and this will, actually, before we do that, we do just need to go and change our file. Otherwise it'll just kind of dump it in here. I'm going to drop this back, and I'm going to go final video. You can see I've been working on a little teaser trailer for this tutorial series. I'm sure you will get to see that at some point. But I'm going to leave that as jumping test animation shot 1 and just go accept, save it again, and let's go render animation. And again, that will take a moment, and I will see you when this is completed. So welcome back again. Our render has now finished. We now have a video format. So I'm going to go over to our video sequencer here and make sure that we've got sequence and preview on here. And we're going to go and delete our reference footage here. We don't need that anymore. Let's go back to frame 1 and just go add movie. And if we just go to our final video, we can bring in our jumping test animation. And here she is. I might just set this to preview only and just kind of maximize my screen real estate here. And we can have a look at our final animation. So again, I just want to congratulate you if you've come this far. You've managed to model, sculpt, UV, texture, rig, adjust weight paintings, even a little bit of scripting in there, and finally animate a character. Particularly if this is one of your first characters, this is a huge undertaking. You've now literally seen the vast majority of an animation pipeline. So congratulations. If you've made it this far and you have an animation, whether it's this animation or something that you've made on your own, I would love to see it. Please share them around, and I will make sure that my details are available to you so that you can send me links. So thank you again for participating in this character design for production. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you've got something great out of it.